You've heard Todd and I both over and over and over say this morning, it's just real difficult to realize that we're at almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon because we're always here looking toward noon. And so you forgive us if not only have we, but if we still call it morning a little bit. Now, in a few hours, there are a few people going to be involved in a little bit of a game of competition that some folks will be watching. I'm sure none of you are bothered with that. But I hope that you have a great time. I hope that your team wins. The only problem with that, I'd say if we did a poll, we'd not have a consensus. This one's kind of interesting. You can't even get a consensus out of the family because you've got two brothers competing against each other, and I think that's just plumb cool. So I hope that you have a wonderful time. And kickoff's at 6:30, is that right? So I've got 10 minutes. I'll try to not go way over 10 minutes, but I don't promise you nothing. I think you would understand this. It's a little bit of a struggle when you've got something momentous coming in the next few days, and I'm not talking about the Super Bowl, to keep your mind from being somewhat consumed in that direction. And so it is with that understanding, if you will give me patience. I am excited about going to Mexico again. We haven't been for a couple of years. Looks like there's some open doors this time that we haven't had for 3 or 4 years into the villages. So we've done a lot of thinking and praying and preparing for that. And so if I sound a little bit scattered this morning, that's part of it. There's other things that we won't talk about, my age and things like that, that's come into play. But please know that we're headed in a direction. Now, as you know, the last few weeks we've been taking one of the ministries of our church and focusing on those ministries. And last week we focused on missions. And today my plan was to go toward probably fellowship, the membership direction. But as the weather did what it did and changed our schedule as it did, and I expected that it would somewhat affect our crowd today, I ask please that I have the right to hold that series until I get back. And this morning I want to just kind of lay a foundation of what all of this is about, this thing called church. Now, there's very few people, if any, that would remember this, but I want to tell you what some of these messages are going to be that tie with these ministries, and this is the foundational message. Back somewhere about 2007, 6 or 7, somewhere along in there, I was reading a book called Simple Church. And that book just really sparked some thoughts in my mind about the purpose of the church. And I did a series of messages called Encountering. And we looked at encountering God, encountering the church, and encountering the world. And as I've thought about what we're going to share about all these ministries, my mind keeps going back to those messages. And so I'm going to use some of them over these next few weeks. Now, after being, now that we're that many years older, 6 or 7 years older, and have had experiences and so forth, I guarantee you they'll change. If you have it recorded in your perfect memory, it will not be the same for sure. But the structure or the skeleton is what I'll be working from. And this was the message that I shared as the foundation of this, and that is that we encounter God, first of all, in our worship. And worship is not simply something you do. It's not simply a style. We have what's called praise and worship, and a lot of churches basically, whether they would define it as this or not, praise is the fast music and worship is the slow music. I was raised in the evangelical church where we had worship service on Sunday morning and the evangelical service on Sunday night. Basically what that meant was Sunday night was real loud and Sunday morning was not quite as loud. And so that's basically all that meant. And so worship is not a style. Worship is not a volume. Worship is not a type of song. Worship is your heart and your relationship with Jesus Christ. And when we come into a worship service, what happens is that we come in, and Jesus doesn't abide in this building, and he's waiting on you to get here, and he was wondering where you were at 10 o'clock this morning. That's not the presence of Jesus. The presence of Jesus is with us at all times. He abides within us. He works within us. He flows through us. So the presence of Jesus is not a church thing, it's a living thing, it's a life thing. But when we come into corporate gathering, really what happens is our minds come into a unity. And that unity focuses on the presence of Jesus. Now again, he is no more here than he is with you every day and any day, but it's when we come together and all of our minds and all of our hearts start to focus on him. That's why the scripture says that he inhabits the praises of his people. It's when all of God's people join their hearts and join their voices in praising him. It is not that he comes, it is that we recognize his presence. And the tragedy that happens is there are churches by the millions all across this world that the presence of Jesus is never even thought of. We have a family in this church that about 20 years ago changed churches. They came here. And the primary reason they came here is because the church they were attending never said the word Jesus. And the criteria for them to look for a new church was that that church simply said his name. That's a good start. George Barna did a research. He's always doing research on the church. He is the church checker. He's checking us up all the time. But he did a research that he published some facts back several years ago. And in that research, he found that nearly 2/3 of regular attendees in the American church has never experienced God's presence in a church service. 2/3. Now, to be honest with you, I don't want to go to church just to go to church. If he weren't going to be here, I don't want to be here. I mean, I like you. And I'd meet you for lunch. But we gather together to be in his presence. And again, we are always in his presence, but when we come together, that we focus our mind on him and on his presence. 48% of regular church attendees have not experienced God's presence in the last year. I think I've mentioned this to you before, but let me just one more time. We have a gentleman in this church that's been with us now a couple, 3 years. Came from a very different type of church than ours. Very different. But seems to be having a ball. So we were working around one day, and I asked him, I said, I need to know something. You've been coming to this church for almost 2 years. And the church you came from was so different than our church. Why have you stayed? Because it has to be different. And he said, oh yeah, it's different. It's real different. I said, well, why have you stayed? He said, because for the first time in my life, Every time I come to church, I feel the presence of the Lord. That is why we worship. That's why we gather in worship, to feel His presence. It is the heart of these that fill this platform Sunday after Sunday. It is their heart that as they sing and play, not that you go, ooh, what great music. I mean, we like to do our best. But the thing we want most is that you sense and recognize the presence of God. Now, I will tell you this. If you truly recognize and admit the presence of God, you will not stay the same. The presence of God can at times be confrontational. The presence of God can be life-altering. The presence of God is just, it's not all about goosebumps. You know, we can come together and get all the goosebumps we want, but if our life is not affected, then God has not worked in our hearts and our lives. And I know that we can feel His presence and sense His presence, and it can affect our emotion. But Jesus didn't die to give us goosebumps. He gave His life. The Father sent His Son that we may have life. And that life will be so that He has affected us in some way or the other. But I'd like to look at one situation very quickly of someone who truly encountered God in worship. The story is found in Isaiah chapter 6, and it takes place in the temple, which was the place that God chose to represent His presence on earth at the time of the Old Testament totally. I love the story because it starts off with just a regular worship service of some kind until Isaiah encounters God. It's as if God opens up heaven to Isaiah's eyes to let him really see what's happening during that worship. Isaiah chapter 6 reads thus. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. He was sitting on a lofty throne, high and lifted up, and the train of His robe filled the temple. Hovering around Him were mighty seraphim. Each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces. With 2 they covered their feet. And with the remaining 2 they flew. In a great chorus they sang, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is filled with His glory. The glorious singing shook the temple to its foundations, and the entire sanctuary was filled with smoke. Were you, in your imagination, fashioning that picture? The seraphim soaring back and forth, crying holy unto the Lord. Isaiah is worshiping at the temple, and as he has many times, and all of a sudden, everything's different. He's able to see beyond the people in the temple. He sees the train of God's robes filling the temple. He sees those seraphims hovering and worshiping, crying out, holy, holy. You see, when we worship God, it affects more than the confines of these walls. It affects more even than our mind, heart, and being. When we worship, God is glorified. God is moved. There's one writer that talks about our lives in worship, and he says our lives in worship is refrigerator art to God. He said our songs are refrigerator art to God. Now, when our kids or grandkids and we have some posts holding our basement up, and they're square, and they've just about now been covered with crayon pictures. They're just stuck everywhere. And why? Because it's the greatest art ever known to man? No, not really. Some of it's a few years old, and we're not even in the lines yet. But because of the representation, because of the relationship that we have. They are precious.